Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
The doctor's office had always had its own atmosphere. Every time Daniel Gill came here, he felt not only the urge to pinch his nose, but also to turn around and run away from all these smells, medical books, and posters. It all filled him with a dreadful sense of melancholy. For a long time, Daniel hadn't been sick and hadn't visited doctors except for his annual health checkup. But since his wife fell off the horse, everything has changed. Now hospitals have become his main destination. He came there several times a week. His wife's condition deteriorated increasingly, and doctors shrugged their shoulders, repeating the same phrase that nothing could be done and that he had to accept and wait for the worst-case scenario. A doctor, a plump man with unnaturally narrow shoulders, entered and sat down behind the desk. He took a folder, pulled it towards himself, frowned somewhat unkindly, and glanced sideways at the familiar face of Daniel. Miguel Serrano always tried to smooth things over. Daniel couldn't stand it. He preferred it when everything was said directly, even if the information was very painful. He'd rather know everything in advance so that he wouldn't hope for the best and then be disappointed. Miguel cleared his throat and set aside the folder. He handed several x-rays to his interlocutor. "It's been several months since your wife fell off the horse so badly. You know, I've devoted 10 years to equestrian sports, but such injuries are extremely rare. I can confidently say that her condition is deteriorating. Unfortunately, I can't help you any further except to alleviate her condition," Miguel said. Daniel stared at him. He didn't expect the response to be so blunt. Perhaps he wasn't as ready to hear the truth as he thought. She had undergone surgery, went through rehabilitation, and now she's lying at home and will soon even stop talking. She can barely utter a word. "This can't be happening. She just fell off a horse," Daniel repeated indignantly. "I'm sorry, Daniel. Sometimes one can break their spine right on their doorstep. A horse is a large animal, and she fell very unfavorably. I can't help you anymore. I think you need to find another specialist or come to terms with the situation." The doctor set the folder aside and then awkwardly shrugged. It felt as if they were discussing a grape variety, not his wife's life. Daniel Gill was one of the most renowned lawyers in the region. He had money, recognition, and connections, but none of it helped. No amount of money mattered when his beloved wife was dying after an unfortunate fall. Daniel left the office and walked down the long corridor, and the doctor's words still echoed in his ears. He wanted to turn back time and not let his wife go on that horse ride, which turned out to be fatal for their family. On the first day, it didn't seem so scary, but then the pain intensified, and paralysis appeared, spreading throughout her body like a plague. Teodoro Fernandez was standing by the car. When he saw his friend, he straightened up, steadying his face. But even without asking anything, it was clear that Daniel hadn't heard anything good. "Is it really that bad?" Teodoro asked in surprise, but he still couldn't understand that money wouldn't help in this situation. "It's just another doctor who just said there's nothing to be done. They all seem like they're all the same. I can't believe no one wants to take on her case. She had undergone the surgery and went through rehab, but there was no effect," Daniel said. Daniel hit the roof of his car, wanting desperately to kick the tire, but he held back. He had been holding back tears for a long time, and now he could almost start crying, risking being seen by others. He was angry at the whole system, at healthcare, and even at his wife, who chose an unsuitable horse for her first ride. No one warned her about the horse's character. "Let's talk to someone who can find you a doctor from abroad. Let's try to make a deal. Maybe we can find some foreign doctor who'll take her case. As far as I know, they can take on any case there, as long as they can make money from it," Teodoro suggested. "I've already talked to so many doctors. It's useless. They're all incompetent fools. Nobody can do anything," Daniel exclaimed. He got into the car, not wanting to expose his emotions to strangers again. Daniel wanted to squeeze something, crush it, and feel something shatter in his strong, muscular hands. The feeling of hopelessness made him lose his composure. He had money and influence. He could go to the best doctors and clinics, but she was still lying in bed, looking at him with eyes full of despair. Daniel dropped off his friend at work, thanking him for being there in such an emotionally heavy moment. He then went home to tell the bleak news to his wife. She wasn't expecting anything, had long given up hope, and didn't believe anyone would help her with such a severe illness. Daniel looked into her eyes and could only think how guilty he was. Why hadn't he gone with her then? Because he decided that work matters were more important? But if he had been there, he would never have let her ride that cursed horse. Daniel gritted his teeth as hard as he could to overcome the wave of anger that surged over him again. Amalia Lozano, his wife's caretaker, was standing on the porch and carefully studying the face of the man who brought bad news, it seemed. She simply nodded to him, as if to say she didn't need any explanations, she had already understood everything. Daniel, maybe you should consider a hospice after all? She needs constant supervision. She doesn't want you fussing over her like she's an infant anymore. It's hard for her to see how she complicates your life, Amalia said, looking him in the eye. Daniel couldn't stand it when someone meddled in his affairs, let alone gave unsolicited advice that he didn't need. He turned to Amalia, who raised her hands in a conciliatory gesture as if to say she understood everything and wouldn't give any more advice, but apparently the elderly woman couldn't resist. Listen, she's not doing well. She's fading away more each day. It's heartbreaking to see. You should either call some doctor from abroad or consider finding her a place where she will be constantly monitored. Maybe some physiotherapy, I don't know, Amalia said. I'll say it only once, Amalia. I won't leave my wife in any hospice. We've been through thick and thin together. I won't allow her last days to be spent in some facility, the man snapped, trying to speak in a tone that brooked no compromise. The woman looked at him, silently nodding. But he could see that his words had no effect. Amalia was one of those women who always had her own opinion, regardless of who she was arguing with. Daniel walked out into the long corridor, at the end of which his wife was. The massive oak doors now seemed out of place, the smell of medicine seeping through them. That used to be her office, and now it was the room where she would die. When he entered, the woman was lying in bed, staring out the window, not reacting to his presence. He realized she had dozed off, but for a moment, it was horrifying to think that she might one day close her eyes like this forever. Marcelina, can you hear me? I met with the doctor. You don't have to say anything. I can tell from your face that there's no good news, his wife said quietly, squeezing the words out as best she could. He looked at her and realized he was losing her with every breath and with every moment. Should he have put off work and spent these last weeks with her? Lie next to her and watch silly TV shows that he didn't want to watch with her before? Should he have brought her flowers every day, the ones she loved? Read her books, since she couldn't do it herself now? All these thoughts raced through his mind like a speeding train, making him feel like he had failed to meet her expectations. I'll never forgive myself if I can't get you out of this nightmare, the man said, looking into her tear-filled eyes. Don't blame yourself, Daniel. I'm going to die soon anyway. It's even harder for me to talk now. Leave me in some sanatorium where I'll be looked after and live your life to the fullest. Don't talk nonsense. When I got sick and all my friends abandoned me, you were there. You've always been there, whether I was poor or rich, healthy or poor. You've always been with me, and I won't leave you, he said. He pressed his forehead against hers, it burned, and the hair on her forehead became unpleasant and sticky. When Marcelina looked at him, he couldn't understand what she was thinking. Her gaze seemed empty and meaningless, as if directed right through him. Marcelina dozed off. When Daniel spoke to her again, she didn't respond. He didn't want to wake her up. The woman, suffering from pain, became thinner and more miserable with each passing day, as if this illness was sucking life out of her. The next day, Daniel was already standing on the porch, watching the young doctor, who had come from abroad. He had invited him a week ago. The doctor agreed to come personally examine the patient and draw his conclusions after an in-person examination. The young doctor extended his hand for a handshake and greeted him in a foreign language, but spoke English fluently and well. The specialist in a white coat disappeared behind the doors of the room. Daniel remained standing in the large living room, awaiting the results. Amalia was making coffee in the kitchen and anxiously watching the homeowner. The man was sulking, immersed in thoughts that didn't bring him joy. The elderly woman herself was well aware of the prospects awaiting the girl dying in the room that once served as her office. I know you hate receiving advice from others, Daniel, but it's time for you to understand that you should prepare for the worst-case scenario. You're a young man, promising, without children, you have a good job and an interesting life, and yet you're about to turn yourself into a widower. Some women mourn their husbands for their entire lives. Why should you do the same? Do you think all men are insensitive? That's not what I meant at all, the woman said, taken aback by his sharp reaction. Amalia tried to smile, but her expression was somewhat guilty. Please understand me too, this won't last forever. Someday you'll walk into the room, and she won't respond to you. But by then, you might have lost your business, all your friendships, and all the romantic threads. You can't give up your own life just because the person you're married to is about to die. I buried my husband once. I regret spending so many years mourning, losing all my friends, and not working. Let me figure out how to live my own life, the man insisted. The woman just snorted, then straightened abruptly and headed towards the room. When the young doctor showed up again, there was no trace of his former confidence and smile, and it was clear that he wouldn't say anything good. Daniel looked at him without much enthusiasm, already understanding that this self-satisfied man had come to stroke his ego but had failed, realizing that he was powerless here, like all the other doctors before him. I've reviewed all the scans and examined the injuries. But, unfortunately, there's nothing I can do to help you. Based on the scans, her condition isn't as extensive, but considering palpation, the situation is much worse. And besides, after such surgery, the chance is minimal. If she hasn't improved in the first few months, you can be sure that she won't get any better. If you want, I can recommend a good facility where she'll be well looked after. Thank you, but I'll decline your offer, Daniel insisted firmly. The doctor fidgeted a bit, apologized, then threw a light coat over his shoulders and disappeared among the uniform green hedges that shielded the house from the front part of the yard. Soon he heard the sound of the departing car, and the man was left alone with his thoughts. Bent in agony, Daniel screamed and threw a glass to the side. He yelled, grabbed objects, and threw them at the walls. They shattered into numerous shards. Falling into the chair, he sobbed, unable to contain the pain any longer. In his mind, various moments from their past lives flashed by. There she was, happily buying an expensive kitten, which would later die from an illness the breeder hadn't warned them about. She cried so much then that he fell in love with her at that moment even more than before. Then she got on the Ferris wheel for the first time, laughing, whispering something to herself, and trying to hide how scared she was. Here she was, standing in a wedding dress, laughing and saying she'd never be a traditional wife, and he said that's why he loved her. Would all these moments stay in the past forever? Would he never hold her again, like before? Would she never sit on his lap and tell her how much he loved her? As if those years of living together never happened. He was crying bitterly, his body was shaking, and he felt nauseous. An unbearable lump formed in his throat. Daniel, calm down. You need to find the strength within yourself to accept it. God never gives us more trials than we can bear. I don't believe in God, Amalia. If he existed, he wouldn't allow her to die so foolishly and painfully now. And now I'm watching her suffer and fade away every day, and I can't do anything about it. He got up from his seat, dragging his feet slowly behind him, and headed towards the office, where he stayed until morning. Maybe he would doze off in the chair. Or maybe he would allow himself to finally cry and relieve the burden of growing pain. The man woke up with a strange sensation, as if he had returned to the past. The voice he had heard several times before now echoed somewhere in the corridor. Daniel raised his head, focused, and only now, dispelling his drowsiness, realized that it wasn't his imagination. Daniel realized that he had fallen asleep right in his office. The headache from the uncomfortable position slowly spread from the back of his head to his eyes. He tossed a pill into a glass, it fizzled and dissolved completely, and then he downed it in one gulp. Only then did Daniel step out onto a small ledge above the stairs, overlooking the living room on the ground floor. It didn't seem to him that his ex-wife was standing there. Wanda didn't even see him, looking around, not glancing up. Then she headed straight to the room of the unfortunate girl, who, most likely, had been in oblivion since early morning. Wanda reached the room and quietly opened it, feeling irritated at the mere thought of seeing the girl again, the one who had broken her life. Wanda was standing there as if glued to the entrance. The wretched dying girl was lying on the bed, deep in a viscous, painful sleep after another dose of medication. Got what you deserved. This is for all my tears shed because of you. As they say, God sees everything, Wanda said quietly, not daring to take her eyes off. She felt some strange feelings in her soul. On one hand, there was a kind of reverence and joy that the girl got what she deserved. On the other hand, she felt a weak, almost painful dose of sympathy. The door creaked open, and someone grabbed her thin wrist and pulled her towards them. Wanda didn't resist, she just walked out, only then raising her eyes to her ex-husband. Daniel looked tormented, clearly suffering as much as the dying girl, who, in Wanda's opinion, deserved everything at the will of fate. His ex-wife didn't say anything, she just headed towards the living room, turned into the kitchen, and, like a housewife, started making morning coffee. The door swung open, and Amalia rushed in, casting a suspicious glance at the former mistress of the house. She greeted them, then frowned, looked piercingly at Daniel, and disappeared into the room of her ward. "Why did you come?" Daniel asked calmly. If he had been in a different mood, he probably would have caused a scene, confronted her, and taken back the keys. She still had them for some reason. But now he had no strength to compete with her, and she seemed to sense that perfectly. Wanda placed a cup in front of him, quickly made herself coffee, and sat across from him. Wanda tried to smile, but he didn't respond to her smile, as if she were a stranger to him. The woman mimicked his expression, brought the cup to her lips, and only then deigned to answer his question. "I found out from our mutual acquaintances that the girl got injured, and now no amount of money can help you bring her back from the other side. Don't you think she got what she deserved? She ruined a family and destroyed our marriage, now let her face the consequences." I wanted to see her and look into the eyes of someone who now realizes that the blows of fate can be much crueler than they may seem. Wanda spoke extremely calmly. For some reason, her words and expressions didn't irritate him. Probably because he didn't have any strength to react. "And you know well that she didn't just fall off that damn horse for no reason. You know, I also did equestrian sports and fell numerous times, but there was nothing even remotely similar," Wanda said smugly. "Aren't you disgusted by your own words? Wasn't she disgusted when she stole a man from his family? It's very interesting to see how it turns out. She ruined my life, deprived me of a family with you, and I can't even be happy that her fate punished her?" Wanda asked. For some reason, this morning, his ex-wife seemed especially beautiful to him, calm, dignified, and slender. There was a special spark in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. And even when her face wasn't adorned with a smile, her expression was attractive. "No one stole me. I'm not a calf. Wherever they lead, there I go. It was my choice, and besides, I honestly told you everything. There were no secrets or intrigues," Daniel said. "Yes, dear, you told me everything after meeting her for almost half a year. You can say whatever you want, but I believe in karma. I'm sure she got what she deserved. I've spent my whole life watching these smug girls tear families apart, and then life punishes them in the most ingenious ways. The universe rightfully punishes all," Wanda said. "So it seems the universe punished you too when your family fell apart?" "Don't oversimplify," Wanda said. For a split second, Daniel forgot that his sick wife was lying in the room. It even made him feel somewhat uneasy. His ex-wife looked at him completely indifferently. For some reason, she seemed special to him now. Wanda was never bad. On the contrary, he often thought that he wasn't worthy of her. When they were married, he devoted too little time to her and then reproached himself for it. After the divorce, Wanda never met anyone else, and when people asked her about it, she always said that she didn't need to look for anyone else. She already had the best, and she didn't want the worst. You know, Daniel, I still love you, despite your unwillingness to admit it. If you ever need support, without all this underlying stuff, I'm always here, Wanda said. He frowned and looked at her, as if it could help them now, as if they were still married, sorting out silly situations that caused them to argue, and again, Wanda was the perfect wife in his eyes. Okay, I have to go. Well, if anything happens, call me, Wanda said, handing him the keys she had been carrying with her all this time. He took the keys and squeezed them into his palm. Her warmth still lingered on the metal. When the phone rang, Daniel picked it up but still stared at the closed door where his ex-wife had disappeared. The house felt empty without her. He felt ashamed of his thoughts and of the images in his head. It was even embarrassing to think that he had returned to his past and, unfortunately, found himself happy there again. Son, are you coming tomorrow? You promised me. Forgot? His mother asked. Her voice sounded alien in this house. He nodded, then remembered and said he would come, as promised. His mother started talking about how tired she was, that she wanted to go on vacation, and that all these country house chores had become unbearable for her. He got tired of listening to her talk because it never led to anything. His mother complained but did nothing to change the situation. The next day, Daniel kissed his sleeping wife and left a note for her on the nightstand saying that he would be with her when he returned from his mother. He held the note in his hand for a few seconds, then crumpled it up and wrote a new one, replacing mother with work. He knew that even in her current condition, Marcelina would worry if she found out that he had gone to his mother, who had never been thrilled with his new wife and, now, in such a sick state, didn't approve at all. Getting into the car, Daniel looked at the overcast sky, hoping it wouldn't rain. It was the last thing he needed right now. He wanted to get to the village, calmly do all the work, and then return home as if nothing had happened, but with a clear head. His mother never called him just like that unless she wanted to stir something up again. He crossed the long bridge, entered the village, and reached his mother's house. The small, neat house, which she flatly refused to change despite her son's money, seemed out of place among the growing cottages. City dwellers came to the village, settled down, and gradually began to boast about their profits, and the houses of the native inhabitants now stood out too conspicuously. Can you imagine that Dorothea already has a third granddaughter? And her daughter is 6 years younger than you, his mother said disapprovingly, once again touching on the topic of grandchildren, with whom she wouldn't even babysit, only asked for photos. He ignored her words once again. His mother clicked her tongue, pretending she hadn't said anything, and then escorted her son into the house. Daniel slung his work jacket over his shoulder, then entered and went upstairs to open the attic. For several hours, he was absorbed in physical labor that seemed to clear his mind. It immediately felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off his chest. Do you remember Viola, Rodrigo's daughter, who you used to play with on the other street? Imagine, she's already had her second child. They're planning to buy a bigger apartment, his mother said from below, apparently taking advantage of her son's hopelessness to continue listening to her. Mom, what the hell do you need grandchildren for if you don't even come to the city? Have you known me for only one day? You'll ask for photos and boast to your friends. And all this fuss falls on my shoulders. I don't want any children, I already have enough problems, the man said, getting angry. That's because you don't have a decent wife, that's why you don't want children. A real man with a good wife always wants children, it's instinct, his mother snapped. Instincts are for dumb animals, and you, Mom, are an educated person. You should understand that shifting responsibility, in this case, is not the best option, the son retorted. His mother cursed vehemently, then went into the kitchen to put on the kettle and set the table. When all the work was done, the man admired the result of his labors for the last time and, for a moment, regretted not choosing some simple manual profession to live in pleasure, to engage in primitive work, instead of getting involved in endless business risks. Daniel went downstairs, hoping that his mother had understood him perfectly and wouldn't start talking nonsense out of nowhere. He sat on a chair, which creaked just like in his childhood. Closing his eyes, he momentarily transported himself back to the moment when he was still a schoolboy, rushing home from school, throwing his backpack, quickly changing, grabbing a sandwich, and running out into the street. They played with the other kids, had races to the river, fished, and played soccer and volleyball. How wonderful and carefree childhood was. How difficult it was now to cope with endless problems. Seriously, do you men have no brains at all? You had a wonderful wife, kind and caring. It was always warm in the house. She worked, managed to keep the house clean, thought about the kids, and worshipped and adored you, probably even more than I did. And what did you do? You dumped her, chose some young girl, and now what? You're lapping it up? May she, his mother continued. Enough, Daniel shouted, pounding his fist on the table. He was shaken by a simple rage that spread inside him like some primitive, uncontrollable feeling. As you wish. Your current wife will die anyway. The Lord doesn't forgive such things. She'll catch a cold, and that's it. And don't be stupid, go back to Wanda. No one will judge you for it. You should pray to all the gods that she hasn't found someone else during this time. And all because she loves a fool like you. Although, if I were her, I would have put some curse on you, his mother said discontentedly. She changed the subject and started babbling about her neighbors, illnesses, and the foolish doctors who work in the local clinic. He was listening to her half-heartedly, attaching almost no importance to her words, because he understood that she would never yield, never like his current wife. Daniel went home late in the evening, turning not towards the private sector, where he lived with his wife, but towards the center, where his friend lived. On the way, he called him and asked to meet for a talk, and his friend agreed unconditionally. Teodoro was almost the only person Daniel could discuss anything with, even cry if the situation demanded it. Come in, I've set the table. I'll call you a sober driver later, Teodoro said, knowing that the conversation would be heavy. As soon as Daniel sat down at the table, he downed a shot, closed his eyes, and just sat there, feeling the bitterness slowly spreading warmth throughout his entire being. I have no idea what to do next. She's getting worse every day. She doesn't even talk anymore, just looks at me with those devoted eyes, and I want to tear my hands off out of despair. I can't help her, I can't. Daniel exclaimed, slamming his fist on the table and feeling that the blow was too strong. The pain sharply struck first in the palm of his hand, then echoed in his elbow. Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking at his friend as if he were apologizing. Daniel, you just need to come to terms with what's happening now. She's going to leave anyway, you won't be able to do anything about it. There are only a few weeks left, at best, and then it will all be over. I'm not saying it's easy, but the sooner you accept it, the easier it will be, Teodoro said, grabbing his friend's wrist. Daniel understood that his friend was right. He sat and nodded. In his mind, he felt guilty for the thoughts he had been having. While his wife lay dying, he thought about returning to Wanda's arms as soon as he became a widower. She would take him in under any circumstances and be there for him as long as he needed it. His former lover wouldn't ask any unnecessary questions, which was what he needed most right now. Take a breath, go out of town alone, and spend some time alone with your thoughts. It would help if you switched gears a bit now before you completely lose it, Teodoro said. Daniel liked this idea, to ask a caregiver to stay with his wife for a few days and then go out of town himself. But as soon as he thought about leaving his wife alone, fearing she would die while he wasn't there, it became unbearable. Daniel arrived home heavily intoxicated a few hours later. He took a shower and collapsed onto the bed, but he couldn't fall asleep despite his state. He was burning up, feeling anger, endless disappointment, and longing, as if life had taught him that no amount of money or influence would help him when real trouble struck. The phone call that rang out in the middle of the night was completely untimely. Daniel almost immediately recognized the voice of his secretary. She was whispering. "Daniel, the alarm went off. You didn't answer, so I went to check myself." "Someone is wandering around the office," the woman said timidly. Any drowsiness vanished instantly. Daniel jumped out of bed, pressing the phone closer to his ear. The door burst open, and Amalia rushed in. "I called an ambulance. She's really bad," Amalia said. Daniel felt torn in two. He needed to go to the office urgently, but he couldn't leave his wife in such a state. He already overused her caregiver, often leaving her until late or even overnight for an extra fee. "Fernanda, call the police." "I'll come later," Daniel said, already rushing down the stairs to see his wife. He stayed with her until the ambulance arrived. As soon as the vehicle appeared in the courtyard, he immediately dashed off and ran to the parking lot to get to the office. She wouldn't remember any of this anyway, he reassured himself. With such a high temperature, Marcelina would be delirious and wouldn't remember how he left her again because of work. He had done this when she was healthy and continued to do so as she faded away before his eyes. To his surprise, Daniel found no police in the office. His secretary was standing on the ground floor, looking around fearfully. "I didn't want to scare him off. I called the police, but they still hadn't arrived. The security system didn't trigger again. Maybe someone there was involved." "Oh, Daniel, what if I called for nothing?" The secretary said tearfully. "Fernanda, you did everything right." "I'll go," he said briskly, literally leaping up the stairs to the office. And when Daniel burst into the office, he caught his friend by the hand. Seeing Teodoro here, quietly rummaging through documents and gathering invoices for the main clients, was a low blow. The police arrived just a few minutes later after the culprit had been caught. In the first second, Teodoro didn't even manage to say anything. He just looked silently, like a guilty puppy who didn't understand what he had done. They quickly put Teodoro in the car, inspected the documents, and asked Daniel a few questions. He answered them dryly and succinctly, so he wouldn't have to repeat himself. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that one of his closest friends turned out to be a traitor. And who could he talk to about it now? Did Teodoro deliberately time it, drugging him and then showing up in the office so he wouldn't hear the alarm go off? "Are you okay?" Fernanda asked. She was standing there, dog-tired, without any makeup. He was not used to seeing her like this at all. Without all those lines, lashes, blush, and rouge, she looked about 6 years younger. He complimented her and promised to arrange a substantial bonus, and Daniel always kept his promises. He sent her home, giving her the day off. He stayed in the office, afraid to call his wife's caregiver. But she called on her own. Daniel was staring at the phone screen, afraid to pick up. What would he hear? Had the situation worsened? Would she never open her eyes again? Or was Marcelina no longer capable of recognizing loved ones? These questions raced through his mind, making him feel panic and fear. "Daniel, your wife was admitted to the hospital tonight. We had to take her in. Her life is not in danger right now, but I strongly recommend that you place her in a specialized facility. She needs constant medical supervision. The situation could worsen at any moment." "Worsen?" Daniel exclaimed, unable to hold back. "Listen," the doctor said, then fell silent for a second, as if giving him time to think carefully about his words. "I've seen many families like yours. I've seen wives caring for dying husbands, and vice versa. I've seen mothers wiping the tears of dying little children. These situations happen, and life is unfair. It's time to accept and learn to live with the situation. Right now, your wife needs your strong will, not lamentations about life." The doctor spoke very bluntly, enunciating each word one after the other, and it was evident he was irritated. He hung up, finally saying that they needed to consider the facility, and then there was silence, unmatched, lonely, and echoing in his chest. Daniel arrived at an empty home. His wife would remain under observation at the hospital for another 2 days. He simultaneously wanted to see her and yet didn't want to find himself back within the hospital walls. Again, those mournful faces of the nurses, the self-satisfied faces of the doctors, who just shrugged and said there was nothing to be done here, that was the fate. A few days later, when he brought his wife home, he decided to stop by the police station, where his former friend awaited him for a conversation. Teodoro was brought into the room with no handcuffs on him, his face was mournful, and his guilty eyes were darting around. "Oh, Daniel, I did it for your sake. You tried to ruin my business for my sake?" Daniel asked skeptically. "It was all Wanda's idea. She came to me and said you were completely falling apart there, that your wife was in a terrible state, and that she would literally be gone any day now. She cried and said how much she loved you and that she didn't want to leave you alone in such a state. I remembered how much you loved her, and I decided it would be better this way. She suggested that I cause you some problems at work. Nothing serious, just enough to make you reconsider. And she would be there for you in your darkest hour, and you would reconcile." Daniel looked at his friend and thought that he had acted, to put it mildly, thoughtlessly. Maybe Wanda was right. Her support and warm feminine hands would be invaluable right now, but causing trouble in business because of it. He didn't have enough problems in life, and now he had to deal with business troubles too. "Daniel, withdraw your statement. For God's sake, don't burden yourself with sin. You know perfectly well how much I value our friendship. I just really wanted to help you. You've completely withered away after this situation. You always look so absent. You grieve as if she's already gone, even though she's still alive. I only wanted what's best for you, and Wanda is right too. She loves you so much, and yet you'll soon be alone anyway." Teodoro concluded his tirade, but it was evident how he immediately regretted his last words, which sounded too cynical, considering that his friend was barely coping with the current situation. Daniel glanced at Teodoro one last time and nodded briefly, saying nothing. He left the room, walked out onto the street, and took a deep breath of the cold air. He wanted to close his eyes, dive headfirst into the sea or ocean, and feel the wave crashing against him, particularly in difficult moments of life. Daniel looked back one last time at the dilapidated building, then walked to his car. He no longer had a friend, and frankly, he no longer had a life either. Daniel arrived home. He could barely drag his feet, lay down on the couch, stare ahead, and didn't understand what to do next with his life. Problems with his wife, his ex-wife, and now Teodoro had joined in. It felt as if fate was testing him. He looked at Amalia. The caregiver for his dying wife looked at him reproachfully. "Daniel, I've been a housekeeper in this house for many years. I've watched your life, so to speak, like a series from the sidelines. And believe me, sometimes it's much clearer from the outside than from right under your nose," she said. Daniel understood that another dose of advice was coming, but he didn't try to stop her. Maybe she was right. Sometimes it should have been much clearer from the outside. Daniel turned away towards the window but didn't say anything to the caregiver. "Your ex-wife came by again. I understand, of course, that she loves you and probably always has. After all, you weren't split up by her initiative. Sometimes, when I think back on your past relationship, I just can't understand why you suddenly decided to cheat on her. But that's not the point. Right now, you need to distance yourself from her and spend these last days with your wife. You can't treat her like this. She's completely alone right now," Amalia said. The man nodded. The caregiver was right, and it was obvious. Daniel felt everything closing in on him, the feeling that everyone around him knew better how to live his life. It was hard to decide when he had so many accumulated problems, and it immediately felt like he wasn't ready to make a serious choice. Wanda is a good woman. You had a solid, honest marriage. If you want to go back to her, no one will judge you, but right now isn't the best time to start an affair on the side, even if it's with your ex-wife, Amalia said. "Amalia, what's all this for? Sometimes we get into trouble for no reason. We didn't deserve them. We didn't mess up anywhere. We deal with troubles, that's all," Amalia said, then left the room, leaving the man alone. Daniel sat, staring out the window, thinking about his life and the changes awaiting him. He was thinking about what he would do when his wife was no longer there. He hardly reacted to anything, he just lay there. Daniel took a hot shower. He stood under the boiling streams and felt like a fool. The hot water washed away all his problems and allowed him to take a deep breath and forget about everything, even if only for a moment. He put on his robe and entered the room where they had spent a lot of time with his wife, with both wives. Daniel collapsed onto the bed, and in an instant, he fell into sleep. He was sitting on a long bench in the village where he was born. Tilting his head back, Daniel felt the scent of approaching spring, a special scent that could only be felt in the village. He closed his eyes, once again recalling the house where he was born and where he spent the first years of his life. Surely, this village no longer existed on maps. No one lived there anymore. People had long abandoned these beautiful places, letting nature reclaim its own. "Oh, my son has come," his father said, descending the steps. Daniel immediately realized that it was all a dream. The realization engulfed him like a white veil. His father had long passed away. It was nice to see him healthy, alive, and relatively young again. He smiled widely, his teeth back in place, speaking easily and freely, as if he no longer suffered from pain. "It's good that you've come. At least you can talk to your old man. I've missed you all so much. You know, Daniel, don't be angry with your mom. She loves you too much. Sometimes she can't help but say nasty things," his father said, lighting up old cigarettes, which probably couldn't be found on shelves anymore. He leaned back against the high crossbar that supported the porch roof. His father always did that. The familiar creak sounded immediately. Daniel was surprised by how many little details from his childhood he remembered, but they had almost all faded away, replaced by new memories. "Be careful now. Don't make any rash decisions, and don't abandon your wife. She didn't abandon you when you were sick. This isn't a game, it's real life. When was the last time you visited her? It pains you to see her, but it brings her joy to spend her last days with you," his father said. "Dad, so many problems have piled up," Daniel said. "I know, son. But you're alive and well, you know how to earn money in this life, you have a profession, a roof over your head, income, a full fridge, hands and feet, you can see, hear, and distinguish colors. You're not plagued by arthritis, and tumors aren't growing on you. You have your own law firm and business. What's there to complain about?" His father was always like that, finding conditions under which the situation could have been worse, and then being glad that he hadn't fallen into that pit yet. Suddenly, Daniel opened his eyes and found himself back in his bed. He longed to be with his father again, to hug him goodbye, pat him firmly on the back, to have him nearby, to give some advice or at least share his optimistic predictions, and to remind him not to complain about everything. Daniel got out of bed, then sat back down and lowered his head. He rested his head in his open palms, sitting quietly and watching as life changed around him, and he couldn't influence it at all. Daniel took a shower, then went down to his wife and spent several hours with her. He courted her, talked to her, read her books, sat beside her, looked into her eyes, and felt his heart breaking with pain. When he came out, he saw his maid hurrying towards him. The girl muttered that his friend had arrived. Daniel just nodded. He stepped into the small, cozy living room, where he saw Teodoro, who was shifting from one foot to another, holding a crumpled black hat in his hands. "Daniel, thank you so much for withdrawing the statement. My God, I'll be grateful to you for the rest of my life. You're my friend, like a brother. I've made a mess of things. I'm so sorry I went along with it. But please forgive me, I'm an idiot. I fell for the tails instead of using my head. It's just painful for me to see what you're becoming. I couldn't bear it, so I fell for it," Teodoro said with unmistakable sorrow and pain in his voice. Daniel felt his heart melting. They truly were like brothers until this situation with the papers in the office in the middle of the night happened. "I got that," Daniel said, then sat down on a chair. His favorite snacks were arranged on the table, but he couldn't eat. He looked at his friend, Teodoro. He was awkwardly smiling, feeling guilty. When Daniel reviewed the documents that Teodoro had planned to take, he realized that he wasn't lying. There were indeed just minor issues, but considering the whole situation, they could also greatly annoy him. Daniel, I regret how it all turned out. I feel like such a fool. You're like a brother to me. We've been friends for so many years. I was at both of your weddings and always supported you, if you haven't forgotten. I made a mistake, but what can I do? I'll prove myself through my actions, Teodoro said remorsefully. You don't have to prove anything, Teodoro. I understand perfectly well how Wanda can persuade. And you'll look her in the eye and think that everything should be this way. Wanda is good at it. She's messed with your head. But why the hell did you fall for all this? Daniel asked. Who knows? I thought I'd help you. Life is a complicated and problematic thing, and so many problems have piled up on you that sometimes you can barely stand on your feet. I thought being with her would make it a bit easier for you, Teodoro said with a guilty voice. Daniel saw his friend off and was left alone. A doctor came to perform the usual procedures that daily tormented his wife. Daniel thought he should go to Wanda, discuss the situation that had arisen, and agree that they shouldn't communicate until the situation was clear. He didn't rule out the idea of reuniting with her when his wife was gone. They knew each other perfectly, and their marriage was excellent, without any problems or hardships. Daniel began to gradually prepare himself. First, he needed to go to the office, settle business matters, and then go to his ex-wife. Surely, she would prepare his favorite stew and put an orange pie on the table, which he adored. And the man, embarrassed in front of her, would babble that now wasn't the best moment to rekindle their relationship. The phone call that rang exactly as he settled into the driver's seat of his car made him involuntarily jump in his place. Daniel took out his phone and put it in his ear. He heard his mother's voice, anxious and full of concern. Daniel, they admitted me to the city hospital. Could you please bring me a couple of new bathrobes and some food? The stuff they feed us here is awful. I didn't want to bother you with a call, but I have no one else to ask. Emilia won't come from the village herself. You know how old her legs are, and taking the bus from the village is not easy, his mother said. Daniel knew perfectly well that his mother deliberately spoke like this to manipulate them. As if she didn't want to call but had no one else. Daniel grunted that he would come himself, turned the car around, and headed straight to the hospital. On the way, he stopped at a store, bought everything he needed, and then entered the narrow, long hallway where patients crowded, waiting for doctors and senior nurses at the reception desk. At the end of the corridor, Daniel saw a familiar, slender, graceful silhouette. Wanda? What the hell was she doing here? Daniel saw the doctor letting Wanda into the ward. When the man in the white coat looked up at Daniel, he frowned. Are you her son? After you talk to your mother, come to my office, please, the man said, and Daniel just nodded in response. Daniel entered his mother's ward. Wanda was sitting next to the bed, stroking the elderly woman's hand. You see, Daniel, a healthy wife is more useful than a sick one, his mother said with a smile. A healthy mother is more useful than a sick one. Right, Mom? Daniel retorted so that she could feel such treatment herself. His mother immediately frowned, as if he had offended her. The woman remembered again that she was actually sick and lying in the hospital. She relaxed her facial muscles, now her expression was more mournful and unhappy. Daniel, thank you for bringing everything, there's nothing here to eat. I'm tired of this food. Can you imagine that my heart skipped a beat last night? I immediately called an ambulance, and they brought me here, although I didn't want to be hospitalized. I called you and Wanda too, and she came faster than my son, the elderly woman reproached. Daniel felt that this conversation would not lead to anything productive, reproaches, or endless pressure from his mother. Daniel was burdened with problems even without her reproaches. Okay, Mom, I have to talk to the doctor first. I'll come to you after work. If you need anything, call me in advance so I can come. The city is jammed with traffic in the evening. It's not like the village, where 2 cars serve the whole village. If you need any medicine or anything else to eat, let me know. I'll bring it, Daniel said calmly, then wanted to leave the room. Wanda, please leave, his mother said, deciding to stay alone with her son. It didn't bode well, but he patiently waited for her to speak her mind. The young woman stood up, quickly glanced at her ex-husband, and then hurried out of the room. Daniel, look, she arrived faster than you. She didn't ask me a single question. She just came, and that's it. Not a person, but a human-sized creature. Stop fussing with your rag doll, take her to some hospice, and focus on your own life. Nobody will judge you, his mother said. Tell me, Mom, would you be pleased if I took you to a hospice, didn't bother with you, didn't care for you, and just dumped you on the medical staff so you could spend your last days there? How would you like that outcome? The man asked. Oh, you're comparing your mother to some girl who has neither brains nor imagination, as they say. You take too much upon yourself, son. But you don't think about what people around you think. He didn't bother to listen to her further. He left the room. Wanda was standing in the corridor, hugging herself as if she were trying to calm down. He saw her insincere concern, but was grateful that she had arrived faster. Why the hell are you and your mother making a circus out of me? I'm sure that when I go to the doctor now, he'll tell me that she's not sick. Do you want me to abandon my wife like that? Daniel asked. Everything is fair in love and war, Daniel. You've lost weight. You're just skin and bones now. It's scary to look at you, and you're still running around with her like a rag doll. And you're doing all this out of guilt, because you realize that you never really loved her. You got involved only because of her youth, and now you can't leave her, Wanda said. Her words suddenly filled him with such anger that his body trembled. Don't say what you don't know. Then why don't you leave her in a clinic? Even the doctors told you it would be good for her. No, out of guilt, you'll keep her by your side to make it seem like you did love her at some point, Wanda said. Tears welled up in her eyes. She suddenly lifted her pretty little head, stared at her ex-husband, and seemed to wait for sympathy from him, but he looked back at her and couldn't give her anything, only being angry that the woman was saying nasty things that, for some reason, seemed close to the truth at that moment. Maybe he never loved her, or maybe he was tired and unable to make decisions now. Anyway, Wanda, leave me alone. You didn't tell me about this before, or what suddenly created a problem out of nothing. As always, right? Go on, Daniel, if you need anything, call me, I'm always available, Wanda said calmly. There was a resolute assurance in her voice that he would definitely call her and still come back to her because he had no other way out. And realizing this made him feel even worse. Daniel climbed the stairs and entered the doctor's office. Everything here was different, as if he had entered someone's small home office, bookshelves, a few folders, dark, cozy wood everywhere. It felt like there was an atmosphere here. The doctor invited him to sit down with a kind smile. Daniel, I understand, of course, that you're paying for the room and the treatment, but, you need to talk to your mother. Are you saying everything is fine with her? I see that you are well aware of this situation, but this false syndrome never leads to anything good and often brings problems aplenty. Please talk to your mother about what she needs right now and why she suddenly decided that it's better to be in the hospital than at home in comfort. I know you're a good person. We've met before in the line of duty. It's just that right now in your life, there are too many problems. Your loved ones need you much more than you might have thought. Daniel just nodded briefly. He understood that this person was right and that, most likely, he had pushed away all his loved ones and done what he had feared most all this time. Offer your mother to go to a sanatorium with a friend and pay for her rest and treatment. Let her feel that she is needed by you even now when you have so many problems. Elderly people at this age are already starting to behave like children, demanding attention. Be more patient with her antics, now you need her more than you think. The doctor's words seemed to be right, but for some reason the man became irritated. Most of all, he was offended that he had to think about everyone in the world, but no one had to care about his feelings. As a man, he should take responsibility, shoulder it, and drag it, just to make it a little easier for others. But who would care about his condition? Who would take on his troubles? From the doctor's office, the man left much more upset than when he entered it. He walked past his mother's room and saw Wanda there, who was smiling gently and quietly stroking her hand. His mother was actively talking about something, gesturing and laughing. Daniel would give anything for everything to fall into place. His wife would be healthy, and his mother would grumble, but he could always rest his head on his wife's shoulder and forget about the problems. Nothing would be so significant and painful right now. Silly work problems that now seemed trivial. 3 days later, when his mother finished her examination, Daniel took her home. He gently put his mother in the car, preparing for an unpleasant conversation. "Listen, Mom, let's make a deal with your wife, including your ex-wife. I'll figure it out myself. I won't tell you anything else about her, and you won't give me any advice on this matter. I'll pay for you to go to a nice sanatorium with your friend, and you'll have an all-inclusive vacation," Daniel said in one breath. He hoped that his mother wouldn't start the same record again and that she didn't need anything. For some reason, this time she silently listened to him. "All right, Daniel. I wanted to ask you for something. Maybe you'll buy me a better house. It's shameful to ask horribly, but this house is falling apart, and I don't have the strength to fix it anymore. My friend's house is no longer anything to speak of, so maybe we could move into some small cottage together, where there's a greenhouse, grow vegetables and herbs, and not think about anything." Evidently, she was stepping over herself to ask for it. Daniel said he would take care of it. Almost the entire way, the woman rode in silence, but towards the end, when the village loomed ahead, she couldn't hold back. "Daniel, just think about it. How do you go about living under these conditions? You're a young man, you have everything ahead of you. Troubles happen in this life, you can't avoid them. I buried your father too, mourned him, and still can't come to terms with it. You're a wonderful person, but sometimes bad things happen even to good people," said the mother. She got out of the car and headed towards her home. On the same day, Daniel paid for her trip with her friend and then looked after the house. He delegated everything to the realtor and his lawyer and went to his office. Daniel tried to keep himself busy with work. The more occupied he was, the less time he had to think about the bad. Twice, he went to his wife, but almost immediately left, seeing her sleepy or already asleep. He didn't notice how tears streamed down her cheek. He left, leaving her with the caregiver or alone. Daniel understood that, as a dutiful husband, he should stay by her side, and it was his direct duty to be there for someone who hadn't abandoned him in such a difficult situation. But he couldn't bring himself to it. He couldn't understand how to look her in the eyes again after all these thoughts about changes in his personal life. He hadn't betrayed her. Sometimes he thought he still loved her as before, despite the illness, but there was still a feeling of guilt in his chest for thinking about returning to his ex-wife. Daniel received a message from his ex-wife that she would be arriving soon. And since he wanted to talk to her, he should speak now, not procrastinate the topic, as always, until it resolved itself. Daniel decided that it was even for the best. They would talk now, and that would be it. Wanda arrived in a simple black dress, and for some reason, he remembered that she wore something similar on their first date. Wanda herself probably didn't remember it. His ex-wife wasn't particularly fixated on memories of the past. She stood downstairs, looking at the china set that was given to him once when he was just starting his career. For him, it was a symbol of how far he had come for the current result. "I remember when you brought this china set home and said you would keep it in memory of how many difficulties you had overcome. I laughed then and said you would throw it away as soon as you had your first big money. But you didn't throw it away. So many years have passed, and it's still standing. It even outlasted me here," Wanda said. When she uttered the last sentence, her voice became bitter and hollow, echoing from the depths of her soul. She turned to him, came closer, pressed her lips against his, and he responded to the kiss. But just a second later, Daniel pushed her away, as if startled by his reaction. "This is all wrong. I don't like any of this," he said roughly, and for some reason, Wanda felt guilty for his feelings. Daniel walked to the bar counter, poured himself a small shot of spirits, downed it in one gulp, and then offered her some. I want us to end all this nonsense, Daniel said. What nonsense can there be here? You acted like a jerk and left me at the hardest time of my life. You just dumped me and went to a younger girl with whom there are no problems or troubles, and while I was struggling in this life as best I could, you were having fun with that kid. And I waited for a call from the one I love, Wanda shouted, no longer able to contain her emotions. What angered her the most was that he was still avoiding responsibility and backpedaling, although it was very easy to tell from his behavior that he was interested in her and simply afraid of judgment. Wanda, we need to end this right now. You go back home, I'll stay at mine, and we never see each other again. I don't want to see you anymore. I don't want you to be in this house. I want you to leave me alone, and we will never go back to the past, Daniel said. Wanda was listening to him with a stone face, then took her jacket and silently walked out onto the street, saying nothing as she left. Daniel was relieved that, at least with this situation, he had finally finished it and no longer needed to suffer from guilt and anticipation of mounting problems. He headed to his wife to spend some more time with her. Daniel drove to the village where his mother lived, where he had already chosen a house for her. The weather outside was terrible. Snow was falling in large flakes, turning into small icicles and stinging the faces of those who thoughtlessly ventured outside. Daniel drove out of the village, and suddenly it seemed to him that there was a strange silhouette on the roadside. Deciding to trust his eyes even in such weather, he slowed down and saw a woman holding a small bundle in her arms. "Get in," Daniel shouted. The man tried to shout over the wind, which at that moment seemed to deliberately become even stronger and fiercer. The young woman looked at him with fear, hesitated for a few seconds, and then finally got into the car. She was covered in a layer of ice, holding the little child. To say that Daniel was surprised would be an understatement. What could a woman with a child do on the road, especially in such weather? "If you're going to the city, then please take me to some crisis center. If you don't know, you can just drop me off at the station. I'll figure it out there," she said, her voice trembling. Only now did Daniel notice that she was wearing a thin jacket, completely unsuitable for the season. The poor woman was shivering from the cold. She curled up, holding the child close to herself, and almost instantly fell asleep, warming up in the car. He didn't take her to any crisis centers. The woman was clearly in distress. When the car stopped, she woke up and immediately stared at the huge house where he had brought her. "Stay with me for a while, and then we'll figure things out. I'm hardly ever home. I have a housekeeper, but she's unlikely to cope with the nanny function. Also, my wife is very ill, so I ask you to behave as quietly as possible in the northern wing," he said. Lorenza looked at him wide-eyed, nodded, and was ready to agree to anything to eat, sleep, and warm up with her child. "Is the child eating formula?" the man asked. She nodded. "Then, while you're on your way, we'll order delivery, and everything will be brought here. Come out, I've already informed my wife's caregiver that you'll be arriving now." Lorenza stepped out, still holding the child to her chest, who had been silent all this time. Daniel watched as she was led into the house, then drove the car into the garage, inspecting the vehicle, which had survived the bad weather without any damage. He should have chosen another day for the trip. Damn it, his last day off was wasted on such a terrible road, where nothing could be seen even at arm's length. The phone call that woke him up in the middle of the night forced him to start thinking quickly. His head was filled with heavy dreams about some swamps, about his past, and a vague idea of the future. The man flew down the stairs, looking for the caregiver who was about to leave. Daniel glanced at the clock. It was 5 in the morning. "Daniel, don't even ask me to stay. You know very well that my child is in the hospital. I urgently need to go to him. If you want to fire me because of this, go ahead, but I won't leave my child there for money," Amalia cut in abruptly. Daniel understood perfectly well how he had tormented her with constant overtime, even though he paid generously for it. Only, the money didn't cover all the inconveniences. "Lorenza," Daniel whispered, approaching her door. When she answered, he cracked the door open. It turned out that the girl wasn't sleeping. She stood by the crib with the baby. "I'm begging you to stay for another day," Or better yet, for 2, take care of my wife. She can't walk. I'm begging you, I have no one else to ask. I have big problems at work. I need to leave urgently. My flight is in 3 hours. Okay, no problem. She agreed so quickly that he was momentarily stunned, froze, looking into her face, and then immediately grabbed her hand and started shaking it up and down. Thank you so much. Thank you. I couldn't even imagine that you'd agree so easily. I was already mentally preparing to persuade you. The man dashed out of the house like a bullet, literally getting dressed on the go, unable to even think about the fact that he needed to have a snack. Everything was mixed up in his head. Only in the taxi did he realize that he hadn't kissed his wife goodbye and hadn't even gone to see her, although this meeting could have been their last. The taxi drove away through the snow, and Daniel just sat there, watching the familiar walls recede. How would he live in this house when she was gone? He didn't know what to do next. How to live without his wife and get everything back to normal. Daniel sat in the airport, watching the planes take off, watching happy people holding tickets in their hands while former passengers with tired faces walked through the sleeves to get to their suitcases. Would he never fly again with his wife for a vacation? Why did he even get involved in this whole story with Wanda? Or maybe she just took advantage of his weakness, knowing full well that he was so broken that he wouldn't be able to refuse her. They announced boarding for his flight. The stream of thought ceased. Daniel jumped up and hurried to his gate to take his seat. As the plane lifted off the ground, his thoughts gradually melted away, replaced by a light drowsiness that became unbearably oppressive. Daniel knew that as soon as he closed his eyes, heavy nightmares would engulf him, as they had repeatedly since his life changed forever. He resolved his issues within a day, although he didn't even expect such a positive outcome. When he arrived home, he swore to himself that he would go straight to his wife, even if it hurt to look at her. The new caregiver easily managed her duties, sending photos to assure him that his wife was doing well and he needed not to worry. Daniel thanked all the gods that suddenly a woman had appeared in his life who had readily taken on the responsibilities of a caregiver at such a crucial time. Daniel shot out of the taxi like a bullet. His thoughts were only of his wife and how he would hug her, hold her close, and endlessly apologize for rarely visiting her. But as soon as Daniel entered the room, he heard heart-wrenching screams and cries. Almost immediately, he guessed that the sounds were coming from his wife's room. Without even taking off his shoes, leaving dark marks on the carpet, he dashed into the room. He couldn't believe his eyes when he saw what he saw. The new caregiver, the same vagrant he had accidentally picked up on the street, had twisted his wife like a screw. She screamed in pain and contorted. In the first moment, Daniel wanted to throttle the girl right there. But before he could move, his wife yelled at him to get out. Daniel left, but then realized that all of this was, at the very least, strange. Bewildered, he finally took off his shoes and now walked on the parquet, trying to distract himself by listening to his footsteps. His wife's screams drove him to the brink of madness. He wanted to burst in, drive everyone away, and be alone with his wife to comfort her endlessly. But when the culprit of what had happened finally emerged, she immediately raised her hands in a conciliatory gesture, staying at a respectful distance from him and fearing his reaction. My father was one of the most renowned manual therapists. He died in a plane crash many years ago, but I helped him. He taught me everything. He got people back on their feet whom doctors had long since given up on. When I saw your wife, I decided to try. I approached her bed and explained that I could try to alleviate her condition. But I immediately warned her that I didn't give any guarantees. After all, the situation was severe. The vagrant spoke calmly, but her voice occasionally trembled. She looked nervously at the man, who could easily become angry. I looked at the x-rays and realized that I could help, or at least try. I asked her permission again, and she blinked. So I started, and all those days you were away, I worked with her. As you can see, she's speaking again, but again, I don't give any guarantees. Lorenza didn't finish her sentence before he collapsed before her on his knees, kissing her hands and trembling with happiness. The vagrant was stunned. She hadn't expected any gratitude at all. She had already been allowed to live with her child in a good house and even earn a little. When Daniel finally calmed down, he sat the woman down at the table to share her story. I, so to speak, got married by accident. My mother was tyrannical. I got married literally within a few months of turning 18. My parents were against it, but I continued to work with my father, learning his skills and abilities. My husband, after my mother died, began to slowly lose control, realizing his impunity. And when my father died, he completely lost it. He started beating me, threatening our child. I tried to escape several times, but he always found me. Here, I feel safe. You understand, there's no reason for such people. There's a way to reason with anyone, the man insisted. Lorenza, you're trying to help me, and I greatly appreciate it. I'll try to help you, even if nothing works out with my wife. Lord, she's smiling again. I saw her smile again after so many difficult months. And I'm ready to make any concessions just for that, said Daniel. Daniel was watching as his wife grew stronger with each passing day. She gradually began to get out of bed, learning to walk again despite the excruciating pain. Daniel watched her and cried tears of happiness, no longer trying to hold back the emotions that overwhelmed him. Soon Daniel was already hugging his wife, and she was crying and thanking him for finding such a wonderful doctor. But I didn't look for her, God sent her to us. There's no other explanation, Daniel said. Soon Marcelina was completely back on her feet, moving without pain, able to walk on her own, take care of herself, and no longer needed a caregiver. Doctors, who had long been monitoring her situation, threw up their hands and exclaimed about miracles. And Daniel himself, along with his wife, believed that this was a real miracle. He hired the best lawyers to act as an impartial party and not handle the case himself. They skillfully dealt with Lorenza's former husband. He was so scared that he even called to apologize, swore that he would never appear in her life again, and then actually disappeared as if he had never existed. Daniel opened an office for his savior, bought her a small apartment, and asked her to contact him at any time if she ever needed help, a caregiver, or moral support. And he also happened to introduce her to his friend and business partner. Alejandro and Lorenza quickly found common ground and began living together within a few months. Lorenza's life, which had deteriorated to the point where she started begging with her child in her arms, who woke up in fear at every sound, changed beyond recognition. Marcelina was back on her bike, engaged in familiar active activities that amused her and brought her a lot of joy. Since she got back on her feet, she has reevaluated a lot. She learned to love life again, admire simple things, and enjoy previously unnoticed moments. I can't believe I'm back on my feet. It's been 6 months since I returned to life, and I still can't believe what I went through, she said, looking at her husband, who now never let her out of his sight. When I was coming home and saw the silhouette on the road, I didn't even know if I should stop. The day was tough, with many problems, and then there were hitchhikers. And if I hadn't stopped then, it's scary to think what would have happened, the man said, burying his nose in his wife's hair. She gently wrapped her arms around his neck, holding onto him as tightly as she could, as if, by letting him go, he would disappear. Since the moment she got back on her feet, it was as if she had fallen in love with him all over again, as if she had rediscovered the wonderful touches, the beloved words whispered in private. All these things had seemed so mundane and simple before, but now she cherished every moment. I'm glad she's doing well now, all the problems are behind us. Truly, I'm glad she found the strength to overcome the crisis. But Marcelina suddenly fell silent, her gaze became distant, then troubled, as if she were going through different scenarios in her mind. I know you've had many problems in your life, and you don't believe in anyone, but I believe fate brought us together, God. Call it what you will. I don't believe in coincidences like that. You met her on the road at night and decided to bring her home, even though she could have been anyone. Suddenly there are problems in the business, and you immediately take off, leaving me with someone you saw for only a few hours. And after that, 6 months pass, and I'm back on my feet. Life turns upside down. Do you think it's all just a coincidence? Marcelina asked. Daniel hugged her tighter. And again, they sat on the veranda, having philosophical conversations. He felt incredibly happy to be able to hug her again, hold her close, and simply listen to her gentle voice sharing her worldview with him. After this situation, I realized that everything is given to us, not just because we need to know how to appreciate the things we take for granted, and all those inconveniences that were with you suddenly became conveniences. But I didn't need that anymore. I realized how much I love you, that I don't want to live without you anymore, your words, gentle touches, and those silly conversations on the veranda where we can spend hours. Maybe you're right, there is a power out there that is much more powerful than we think, Daniel said. In the end, despite the toughest trial, everything worked out wonderfully. Marcelina recovered from her injury and returned to her old life. Daniel spent less time at work and more time with his family. He and Marcelina thought about children and planned to change their usual way of life. Lorenza worked in her office, was happy in her new marriage, and tried not to remember the nightmares she had overcome in the past.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.